Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Grueskin. I'm the Academic Dean at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm glad to welcome you here to this event tonight at the Italian Academy. A little over 10 years ago, shortly after the September 11th attacks, many Western journalists flocked to Afghanistan to learn more about the breeding ground for the terrorists who had so transformed our world that day. Those journalists who were packing Swiss Army knives, water purification tablets, and satellite phones, most of them also carried a copy of Ahmed Rashid's recent book and seminal book, Taliban. That book sold more than 1.5 million copies worldwide, an astonishing number given the subject and the tone. I happened to reread it over the weekend, and it's really amazing how well Taliban holds up, even though it was written before the attacks on this country. In prose that is both compelling and insightful, Ahmed explained the military and political strategy of the Taliban and set a foundation to help Westerners like many of us here tonight to understand the complex and frightening ways of the movement, the xenophobia, the constant demeaning of women, the dependence on the heroin trade, and most of all, the living hell it created for the Afghan people. It is thus understandable why Christopher Hitchens once called Ahmed Pakistan's best and bravest journalist, because his courage has been as essential as his intelligence in bringing the story to a larger audience. Ahmed is a Cambridge University graduate who witnessed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the late 1970s. He was the first foreign journalist to interview the Taliban in 1994, and he was in Kabul when the Taliban overran that city a few years later. Throughout the invasion and beyond, his reporting in the Far Eastern Economic Review, The Independent, and many other publications helped bring to light the devastation in a corner of the world that few of us really understood. We've been fortunate to welcome Rashid as a guest at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism this semester, where he's been meeting with students and faculty to deepen our understanding of South Asia. His newest book just came out this week. In Pakistan on the Brink, he examines the many errors of judgment and understanding that have beset the major players in this area, from the men who run Pakistan's ISI to the state and defense officials in the Bush and the Obama administrations. We would also like to welcome Steve Coll, whose Pulitzer-winning book Ghost Wars did so much to inform us of the complex history of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden several years after the 9/11 attacks. Steve, a longtime correspondent and a senior editor at the Washington Post, now serves as president of the New America Foundation and is a writer for The New Yorker. With no more remarks, I'm very pleased to welcome Ahmed and Steve to the podium tonight. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. Our plan tonight, we've got about an hour together. We've got some very bright television lights that may interfere with my ability to see you when your time comes, but our plan is that Ahmed and I will talk for about 25 minutes or half an hour or so. I'll ask him some questions, and then at a certain stage I'll ask you to present your own questions. There is that microphone right there in the aisle that you can line up behind, and there may also be someone roving for those of you who are on the edges and such. Just do please identify yourself and keep it brief. There's no doubt that there's going to be many more of you who want to participate than we'll have time for. Thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me to be with you tonight, and congratulations on this book, which, if that's a camera, I'm going to point it at it. This is really the third, as you say, you use the word trilogy, and I think I recognize a kind of self-consciousness in the work that you've been doing between hardcovers about this essential subject, from the Taliban to Descent into Chaos, the great and authoritative book that you produced after the September 11th attacks, and now this is a kind of bookend. And as you say in the introduction, this is a little more meditative and a little more forward-looking and a little more focused on the issues that bedevil Pakistanis, Afghans, and Americans in common. And so I think that's a terrific basis for our conversation. I first went out to the region in 1989 as a green correspondent for the Washington Post, and every time I came through Lahore, Ahmed's house was a place to be educated, and that's still the case all these years later. So I feel like we're having the same conversation we had all that time ago. And of course, the first question everyone arrives in Lahore to ask you is, what is the nature of the crisis in Pakistan this month, Ahmed? And Pakistan is on the brink, but it's always on the brink of something. And I wonder, there is a kind of an accumulation, as you point out in some of these essays, about the failures of the military to come to terms with the true nature of Pakistan's national security, the failures of education, the rise of radicalism. But thinking in the long arc that you've been writing, how serious, what is the nature of the crisis today? How is it different from other periods of crisis that you've chronicled and lived through?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you very much for coming, and thank all of you for coming, and I thank Columbia University for inviting me to be here for this semester. Very, very kind. Everyone connected with the School of Journalism. I think the essential problem, Steve, is that we never grew up after the Cold War ended. The Pakistani elite, which is the military and the civilian elite, never realized that the end of the Cold War meant that you could no longer basically, and certainly 9/11 only reinforced that you could no longer keep extreme Islamic extremists as a front line against India or to use in Afghanistan. That you could not have a foreign policy that was based solely on trying to develop scare tactics, in the region. That you needed trade and economic advancement and all the rest of it, and for that you needed the neighboring countries to be part of a solution. And lastly, you needed to break the dependence that you had on the United States during the Cold War, and you needed to develop your own economy and society and all the rest of it. And essentially, I think the struggle, after 1989, for the last 20 years, has been trying to alert the Pakistani elite that, look, the essentials of foreign policy that you have pursued since 1947 no longer work. And I think that is the essence of a crisis. I mean, most countries have a foreign policy that reflects domestic politics and domestic developments and all the rest of it. We have a country where where foreign policy sets the tone of domestic development. So, for example, we have nuclear weapons, but we have no education, or we have no health care. We can't take care of our own public. The last line in the book, I say, the essential factor is that the Pakistani elite has not fulfilled its essential task, which was to take care of the Pakistani people. And that's where, crisis after crisis comes.
So, but how healthy or unhealthy today is civilian politics and civil society-led pressure in Pakistan? How are we on the outside to understand where the PPP government stands? We may have an election later this year or next year that would mark the first peaceful handoff of an elected civilian government to another. The lawyers' movement, the court, civil society activism in at least some of the urban areas seems to be rising to some extent, certainly compared to the dark days a couple of days ago. But is there a there? Is there enough of an opposition to the military's influence to make a difference?
Well, there's no doubt that especially the domestic political crisis in the last year has been generated by the Supreme Court and the military going for the government, basically trying to topple the government, without wanting to launch a coup, as is the usual norm for the military in Pakistan. But at the same time, the crisis has been perpetrated also by the civilian government of the People's Party, because it has been so inept, it has been extremely corrupt, it's developed a terrible reputation, and it's done very little, for the people. So you have this double whammy of, a military that really nobody wants, and a military that is perhaps much weaker than it was before, because there's now a much greater public resistance to a coup and to military rule than there perhaps ever was before in Pakistan. And the military is deeply aware of this, I think. But at the same time, you have a very corrupt and inept government, which has not been able to deliver the goods. And I do hope, as you say, that there will be an election. A bad, incompetent, corrupt democracy is still better than military rule, because military rule has led us into 4 times into a cul-de-sac. where we have to reinvent the wheel and reinvent the wheel of democracy every decade. Military rule lasts for 10 years, and then suddenly, it collapses because of some reason or the other, and we have to reinvent democracy again. So I hope that this election, this government will probably lose the election. There will be another complicated coalition government. I hope that this will be then sustainable, and hopefully the next government and the government after that, as long as there's no military intervention, will be better. And I think the rise of civil society has been very important. But civil society is also very divided. There's a very determined right-wing extremist civil society that is Islamist, anti-Western, anti-democracy, and there's also there's a liberal civil society which wants democracy and good governance and, for the military to go back to the barracks and, all the rest of it. So civil society is also very polarized right now in Pakistan.
I know we want to jump and talk about Afghanistan, but you mentioned that the military does not seem to be in a position to be able to intervene now. It's certainly not one of those moments of kind of rescue narrative where the body politic is wishing for military intervention. To the contrary, if they did intervene, they'd probably face stiff resistance. Why?
Well, I think the Musharraf era, people are seeing, the record of the Musharraf era, the getting bogged down in Afghanistan, hosting the Taliban, allowing the growth and the birth and growth of the Pakistani Taliban, the failure to really invest in Pakistan's economy, even though we were getting, $2 to $3 billion a year from the Americans. We got a huge debt write-offs after 9/11, etc. There was just no investment in the country and in the people. Education level is, after 10 years of Musharraf's rule, was the same. So I think that's part of it. But also, I think if you look at it, every coup in Pakistan has been welcomed by and large by the majority of the population. The army knows perfectly well that this time round, half the population would be completely against any kind of military rule. And perhaps there would only be a very small fringe of right-wing religious parties and right-wing sort of, nutters, basically, who would back a military coup. And, of course, a military coup would be disastrous. I mean, the 21st century, a country of 180 million people should not be having military coups. They should be allowing democracy to progress. But the essential factor is still that foreign policy is in the hands of the military. And unless the military learns and desires a change where it makes friends with neighboring states, it builds up trade and the economy, etc., and concentrates on Pakistan's own internal situation, rather than having these adventures in Afghanistan, adventures in Kashmir, then we're not going to change. No civilian government can change the military's foreign policy, except the military itself.
Well, one of the neighbors that the military would have to come to terms with, of course, is Afghanistan, which has been a problematic neighbor since 1979 or earlier. And I wanted to ask you just your impressions of how severe and worrisome the patterns of instability emerging in Afghanistan are in your judgment now. You've witnessed Afghan governments unravel at multiple intervals for 30 years. The headlines feel very discouraging because of these horrifying incidents. But when you talk to President Karzai or people around him, and you think about the political forces and compacts that are holding Kabul together now, what's your reading? Are they stable? Can they withstand the pressures that are being placed upon them over the next year or two at least?
I think the situation in Afghanistan is now very, very fragile, and the government is very vulnerable, and the essential 3-4 months ago, what people were talking about, an orderly withdrawal of Western forces, NATO and US forces, really may not be possible. Now, I think there are several reasons for this. This war has gone on far too long. It's 10 years, over 10 years, the longest war the Americans have ever fought. What we are seeing in these signs of this killing of the Afghan civilians, the burning of the Qurans, etc. I mean, you may be witnessing the start part of a serious deterioration of discipline and morale in the U.S. military, which is not surprising given, these tours of duty and etc. Secondly, I think the real pursuit at this stage should be a political strategy to bring the war to an end. America cannot leave Afghanistan and leave behind a civil war going on and expect that this Afghan army, which it has trained and which it has poured billions of dollars into, will somehow hold the line and be able to fight as well as the Americans have or resist the Taliban. So essentially what is needed is a political strategy which has started, but it's going in fits and starts. It's going far too slowly, and part of the reason is that there are divisions in Washington about that. Within the administration as to whether the Americans should pursue a faster track negotiation with the Taliban or a slower track. And the military still has to be fully brought on board with this idea of a negotiated settlement. But, I think two things are needed essentially as far as the Western intervention is concerned. The need for an orderly withdrawal, not a withdrawal where you're sort of having to fire, behind your shoulder as you retreat, as you withdraw. And secondly, to leave behind an end to this civil war that is going on in Afghanistan. Some kind of ceasefire, some kind of political negotiation between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Now, that's one thing. But on the other hand, you've got a government that is very, very unstable. It's facing a lot of opposition from anti-Taliban militias and warlords in the north of the country who don't want to dialogue with the Taliban. There's rising anti-Americanism. There's, of course, the continued bane of corruption and incompetence by the government. But I think even more critical than anything else right now is the failure of the West to have built some kind of indigenous economy in Afghanistan. Because what's going to happen after the withdrawal is that the economy is totally dependent on the Western intervention. I mean, the tens of thousands of Afghans are needed to service the 150,000 troops that are there. And the moment these troops leave, what do these Afghans do? And these Afghans, by the way, are educated, they speak English, they are part of the pro-democracy, pro-Western kind of new Afghan elite that has arisen within the last 10 years. And these guys are all going to be jobless. And they're going to be looking for ways to leave the country, not to stay. So there's a domestic crisis, there is an American strategic crisis, and finally there's the crisis of the region and the neighbors. Iran, Pakistan, Russia and Central Asia, India. How will these countries deal with an American withdrawal?
And when you talk about political strategy, obviously one element of that you referred to is direct talks with the Taliban. And there's quite a strong chapter in this book, Pakistan on the Brink, about the history of these negotiations, really very revealing and authoritative. And I wonder, you've been watching the Taliban from their birth. You wrote the first and definitive book about them in the 1990s. You obviously favor the negotiations with them now and believe that they could produce a reduction in violence that could ease the American withdrawal and make it less likely that a terrible civil war is left behind. But what would you say it's realistic to hope or expect that the Taliban would accept, given that they are a declared revolutionary movement, they're an Islamic emirate in exile, they believe the government that they had was improperly taken from them by foreigners? What kind of an outcome, at least an interim outcome of negotiations, do you think it's realistic to hope for?
No, I think the Taliban are equally exhausted. They suffered enormous losses also. They are fed up of living in exile in Pakistan and being manipulated by Pakistani intelligence. They're Afghan. They want to go home, to their country, and get, they consider a longer period living in Pakistan almost a trap. And at the same time, I mean, we have seen some moderation in their views. I mean, They are not anti, girls' education now. They have condemned Al-Qaeda as strongly as they can without an actual settlement. So what I see is a process that really should be stepped up now. A series of trust-building, confidence-building measures between the U.S. and the Taliban, which quickly have to become military trust-building. In other words, the Taliban would have to reduce their military activities in exchange for the U.S. to do the same. Maybe not all at once, maybe, province by province or for a period. The U.S. will say, well, we'll stop night raids, into arresting and capturing Taliban if you stop assassinating government officials or stop these mine warfare or stop something else. And this could then be extended into both sides would be testing each other to see how genuine the other side is in this field. And then you would have to, then hopefully, once you could establish a reduction in the violence, I don't say ceasefire, but a reduction in the violence, then you would involve the Afghan government and try and start political negotiations, which would have to be between the Afghan government and the Taliban. So, I don't see this as impossible. I remember very well the Soviets. I spent time with Shevardnadze, the foreign minister at that time. The Soviets were desperate for a political settlement with the Mujahideen at that time as they withdrew out of Afghanistan. And a lot of the Mujahideen actually wanted a political settlement. They had the same problem. They were fed up with being in Pakistan. They were fed up with being manipulated by the CIA and the ISI and all these other organizations. They wanted to go home. And what happened was, of course, that the CIA and Pakistan's military, both of them, did not favor a political settlement. They wanted to see the actual defeat of the communists. So we're almost having seen that whole process unravel, and the Soviets then having to get out without a political settlement, and then, of course, the civil war starts in Afghanistan, in 1989-90. I'm deeply, deeply pessimistic. I've seen one unraveling of a superpower involvement in Afghanistan, one failure to have a political settlement or to be able to put together a political settlement. I hope that the Americans don't make the same mistake that the Soviets did. I hope they learn something from the Soviet experience, that you need to end this war before you leave.
The Taliban have now issued a statement suspending the talks. I don't know how seriously you take that. Is that just negotiating? And then another element of this is that the Taliban themselves seem to want to talk to the Americans because they're the foreigners and the fielded army that they contest. And they're less interested in talking to President Karzai. But as you were just outlining what the opportunity here is, you were making the point that it's an intra-Afghan negotiation that would ultimately reduce violence in any sustainable way. So, A, how serious is this breach in the talks, so far as you can tell? And B, where does President Karzai fit in this picture, given that he has felt annoyed with the Americans leaving him out of these talks, and also, at least in theory, in 2014, he's meant to leave office and see a successor come in?
Well, look, there have been 3 incidents involving American forces. The American soldiers urinating on the dead bodies of Taliban, the burning of the Qurans, and this recent incident. Each one of these incidents could have led to the Taliban suspending talks, but they didn't. And I think that was a very, it was a very pointed thing that the Taliban did. They kept the talks moving. I mean, even through this last couple of months of these incidents happening. They condemned the incidents, of course, and were very brutal and said, we'll behead the Americans and we'll kill them if we see them and all the rest of it. But they did not suspend the talks. Now they have suspended the talks. And that has a lot to do with the slowness of the Obama administration in really responding to the first confidence-building measure, which has been this exchange of prisoners, essentially, between the Taliban and the Americans. And this has been pending for the last 3 or 4 months, and there doesn't seem to be very much progress. I hope that there will be progress on this in the next few weeks. And I do believe that the Taliban will then resume talks again. Because, the need to talk to the Americans, obviously, is they have to deal with the military situation first in Afghanistan. And there's no point in talking to Karzai about the military situation, because he's not in control of the military situation. The Americans are. So Karzai comes in at a later stage when you actually are talking about some kind of sharing of power in Kabul between Karzai and the Taliban. So I'm confident that the talks will resume quite soon. Yes, I mean, the very big issue is President Karzai. He has been very erratic. And he's been very frustrated by the Americans and by frankly the erraticism of Washington, which has been no less than his erraticism. I mean, especially over the last few months. And as I say, this continued division in the American administration over whether to talk, not to talk, whether to fight, not to fight, what to do, etc. He's only allowed 2 terms as president. He finishes his term in 2014. Now, of course...
Do you think he'll leave?
I really can't say. I mean, I hope he does. I hope he does. And certainly if I was President Karzai, I would be telling him that you should, from now, be preparing to leave and anoint someone who you would like to see succeed you, and prepare the ground for that, and give Afghan people the confidence that you will be leaving. There will be a free and fair election, or a better election than was held last time in 2014. And also this would, to a large extent, gratify the international community and encourage the international community to continue giving aid to you. Because at the moment, frankly, I mean, the mood in Europe right now, and I think, I haven't been to Washington yet, but I mean, even there would be, I mean, nobody wants to help Afghanistan in real terms beyond 2014. And of course, Afghanistan is going to need large quantities of aid for many years to come, if for nothing else than to sustain the army. Karzai has to take certain steps for his country and to keep the international community on board. And certainly this is not going to be done if he insists that, oh no, I'm indispensable, I will delay the elections, or I will stand for a 3rd term. I think this would be a huge, huge mistake, and could really bring the whole, his whole government crumbling down, and perhaps force the Taliban to do nothing else except to take Kabul eventually.
Now, the subtitle of the book is The Future of America, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and you have a number of sort of interlinked essays towards the back of the book that are all very strong. And it seemed, if I read them right, that one of your themes was that you feel that the American design, the strategic design that the United States has looking forward for Afghanistan, for its relations, its role in Afghanistan, its relations with its role in Pakistan, remains a muddle. Now, we were talking before, I was on a call, a background call that the White House put on for Afghan watchers today to talk about how things are going. And the good news is things are going really, really well, apparently. Everything is right on track. There's not a single aspect of the plan that is in trouble. So that gives us some time to think about the design that you have in mind. And I wonder really what you mean when you say that the United States needs to clarify or improve, in effect, its strategic vision for the region after 2014. What are the missing elements of that? What are the sources of confusion that are really making things worse now?
Well, I think the first thing is that there has to be a united U.S. plan. You can't have a plan that, one plan by the Pentagon and one plan by the State Department. You have to have a united plan. There has to be, the U.S. has to help broker an internal settlement and a regional settlement. Now, this is very difficult because you have no relations with Iran, and of course relations with Iran are very bad because of the nuclear situation. And right now, today, as of today, for the last 4 months, you had no speaking relationship with Pakistan either. I hope that will be rectified very soon, but it's at the moment, it's a complete dead end. So there has to be unity on these two things, seeking an internal settlement. And I've supported a lot of the things President Obama has done. The surge was matched, the military surge was matched by a civilian surge, more money for development, etc. But it couldn't take off because the fighting intensified. But what my criticism of this administration has been that they have pursued many different initiatives, none of them fully, none of them with consistency. None of them to the end. I mean, what happened to, for example, the whole counterinsurgency doctrine that General Petraeus introduced in Afghanistan, which was, we're fighting to protect the people and to build these enclaves in the people. That's almost disappeared from the reports or from anything that the administration says. Again, the failure in the last 3 to 4 years to be aware that, the Afghans need an economy to keep this country going. And the failure really to build an indigenous economy that is not dependent on just foreign forces. So I think, and I think, the biggest problem is right now in the United States that as a result of 2, Bush presidencies and 2 wars that you fought, and God forbid that there might be a 3rd war with Iran, but, the military has exerted enormous political pressure on the civil administration. It's quite, a lot of people, Pakistanis say, it's quite similar to the situation in Pakistan, that you have an overwhelming military, basically, who dictate and push through their concept of foreign policy. And invariably it's to do with force of arms, victory, we will not accept being driven out by the Taliban, that kind of thing. Now, I think that is changing. Because, I hope it is changing, and certainly after these incidents, it needs to be changed. But I think President Obama has been trapped in this outcome, which is not a result of his policies so much as a result of President Bush's policies of having fought 2 wars. And quite frankly, right now, many Muslims around the world are fearing that if the United States, having attacked 2 Muslim countries in the last 10 years, if it attacks a 3rd, in other words, Iran, there is no saying what chaos and confusion could ensure for American foreign policy in the broader Muslim world. It could completely undermine the Arab Spring. It could undermine all the democratic aspirations that are going on right now in the Middle East. It could completely undermine Pakistan and Afghanistan. And several other countries along the way. And I just hope that, this doesn't happen, that there is some settlement with Iran.
So I want to, in a moment, invite the audience to join us. And so those of you who have questions, if you'd like to start lining up at the microphone, you can do that. I have one more just to complete the loop on this. If the problem with American policy or the design of American policy in Afghanistan, as you were just saying, is part that it's fight and talk simultaneously, which seem not always to join together as a unified approach very well. In Pakistan, tonight, the parliament is going to start a debate about the future, from Pakistan's perspective, of relations with the United States. The U.S. is in multiple conversations in Washington, as I'm sure you'll join when you get there, about whether the relationship between the United States and Pakistan should be redesigned in some way, reset, redefined. What is a sustainable basis, a mutually sustainable basis, for relations, civilian-led relations between the United States and Pakistan over the next 20 years? What should be the basis for a rethinking of that relationship?
Well, I think from the American side, the Pakistanis need to be taken into confidence about these talks, and they need to be brought in at some level with these talks with the Taliban. The more that they're kept out, the more angry and sidelined the military and the intelligence will feel, and the more resentment will build up inside the country, propagated, by the intelligence services, that the Americans are trying to cut a separate deal without Pakistan. Now, so I think, that's the first thing. I think the second thing really is that, yes, the relationship is going to be entirely reset. There's no doubt in my mind. And there will be restrictions placed on the kind of freedom that the U.S. intelligence and the drone attacks and the U.S. had during the Bush administration. I mean, when literally hundreds, if not thousands, of contractors and CIA were operating in Pakistan, etc. Well, I really think that what the U.S. has to do now, a lot of this bad blood that was created between the U.S. military and the Pakistan military was a result of what was felt as U.S. pressure on the Pakistani military to do this or that. Now, I think what long-term U.S. strategy should be is, how does the U.S. help change without putting, day-to-day, daily pressure, go after this terrorist, go after that terrorist. Forget the intelligence relationship. If that is not going to be restored in the way it existed before, forget about it. You don't need American generals going to Islamabad saying, go after the Haqqani network, go after this network. What you need is American civilian support, basically, for a shift in Pakistan's strategic dimensions. And you need a real strategic dialogue with Pakistan as to how far Pakistan is willing to shift its foreign policy, what I've been talking about, and what the U.S. can do to help. Not the U.S. dictating what Pakistan should do, but how the U.S. can help economically, building, improving relations with India, trade links, energy, electricity, etc. And how the U.S. can also help in galvanizing the international community to make sure that Afghanistan and Pakistan remain on the agenda, despite the international recession and the economic collapse in Europe and, all the rest of it. So I think, the U.S. also needs to shift towards a longer view and a more strategic view about not wanting a day-to-day result, in the tribal areas about so-and-so terrorists. But let me, having said that, I as you will read in this book, I'm extremely critical of Pakistan's continued desire to keep the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, for as long as possible on Pakistani soil, allow them to continue fighting. I think Pakistan should give a deadline now, or at least once the relationship with the U.S. resumes, give a deadline to the Afghan Taliban. You have to leave this country in 6 months or a year. You have to settle your problems with the Americans, settle your problems with Karzai, and leave. We are not going to sustain you for any longer. I think that kind of step would win enormous international support for Pakistan. But, that would obviously mean a complete, U-turn as far as our foreign policy is concerned.
Well, let me invite the audience. I can't really tell in this glare whether someone is standing at the microphone or approaching it. So please do identify yourself and ask a direct question, if you will.
My name is Roy Wabdi. I'm a student at the law school next door. And my question is, how do you think the Pakistani public's mood would react to a change either in the current administration or a future one if the focus moved away from external threats like with India or the Afghan Taliban and moved towards the economy? In other words, is there a sort of point of pride in the Pakistani public that is related to holding on to Kashmir or the Afghan Taliban or other external influences that maybe would be an internal reason that the government keeps these militaristic options on the table?
Look, I mean, there's no doubt that there's very strong anti-Americanism right now in Pakistan. But I really believe that people, this could change. And people really want to live normal lives. And what I said, earlier about the military being unsure of itself, the military not being able to launch a coup, not because, it suddenly changed, but because it knows that half the population would not support it. I think, most Pakistanis want to, see prosperity, education, economic development, and they have not been, provided that in 60 so many years. So I think certainly now there's a huge change towards India amongst the population, perhaps not with the army so much. The business community wants to do business with India. They want investment from India. They want to trade with India. Now, obviously, you've got to settle your differences with India in order for that to happen. And I think, the real issue is that Pakistan is the geography of Pakistan should have been, is at the center of all these trade links, Iran to India, Central Asia to the Gulf. Pakistan could be a land bridge for enormous economic productivity in this region. And it has not given itself the opportunity to do so. It needs to do so. And I think the public would really support that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rainika Agarwal. I'm a senior in the college. My question is twofold. First of all, I want to go back to the warlords. So if you look at Atta Muhammad Noor, for example, and you look at the success that he's had in the Balkh province, I guess my question is, do you see Karzai and cooperation with the northern warlords as potentially being a viable political option? Could they perhaps aid in anti-Talibanism? And my second question is, you kept stressing that there's an importance to build a domestic economy, but do you have specific, I guess, recommendations or ideas as to how to do that, given that, for example, the climate, the environment is very arid, trade would be dependent on international relations, which of course are in a very tenuous position right now. So kind of what do you see as concrete steps to doing that?
For the Afghan economy?
In Afghanistan.
Yes, yes, both for Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, as far as, Karzai is concerned, I hope that he won't be there in 2014. I hope he will step down. And that I think it's very critical that Afghanistan does have a new leadership. Who can bridge the gap, the ethnic divide. The ethnic divide is now very serious in Afghanistan, and especially over this whole dialogue with the Taliban. And you need a new face, a new figure, with endorsement from Karzai, with endorsement from the West, from the Americans, etc. You need a new political dispensation in Kabul, and I hope that that will happen in 2014. As far as the economy is concerned, look, I mean, even, for example, right now, the electricity in northern Afghanistan is being provided from Central Asia. The electricity in western Afghanistan is being provided by Iran. Now, this is all without, these are local warlords who've concocted their own deals with the neighboring countries. And in fact, the electricity that comes to Kabul is coming from Uzbekistan. So you already have the basis for what Afghanistan would be best at also as a land bridge. This is a landlocked country. It's got 6 neighbors. And all these neighbors want to trade with each other by road, by rail, except they're blocked because there's a war going on in Afghanistan. If that war ends, you could make a lot of money from being this land bridge. There's, the whole idea of pipelines, oil and gas coming from Central Asia, feeding energy-starved Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and then, trade with the Gulf, etc. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing is, investment in agriculture. Afghanistan remains, despite, a very difficult terrain, only 12% of Afghan territory is actually arable. But, in the 1970s, they fed themselves. They had a small agricultural surplus that they exported. We haven't even been able to restore the state of the economy in 1978, before the communist coup took place. So, and that was heavily dependent on agriculture. Obviously, today you can do wondrous things, canning and freezing and shipping and, all this kind of stuff. I mean, the fruits of Afghanistan in the 70s were sold in India, in Pakistan, in Iran, and in the Gulf. Today, doing that would be 10 times easier than what it was in the 70s because of transport and all the, etc. So I think there's an enormous potential. It just has not been developed or built up, unfortunately.
And what role do you see the warlords playing going forward, the northern warlords in Afghanistan?
Well, I hope that if there's a new political leadership, they will cooperate. And I think if there's progress in the talks with the Taliban, if the Americans and the Taliban show progress, I think the mood can shift very rapidly. Because, at the end of the day, even the northern warlords do not want another civil war. They don't want to go and fight again.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, we throw that term around, warlords. It's not really clear who deserves it and who doesn't here in the United States or in Afghanistan. And but when you talk about a new political dispensation in 2014, a world after Karzai, it's so critical. And you say the next leader would need to hold the confidence of non-Taliban Pashtuns, not be anathema to the Taliban, presumably, hold the confidence of the international community, and not ignite a civil war by northern groups that are fearful of Taliban hegemony. So that's That's a heck of a search committee task that's being. So if you want to name names, I welcome you. But where is that leader going to come from in Afghanistan today? And also, Karzai's going to have to anoint them, and his family and his networks are going to have confidence. He's not going to throw them all in front of the ICC.
Yeah.
So where does this person come from?
Well, look, I mean, there have been some very good ministers in the Afghan government over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, all of them have been thrown out by Karzai, partly because they were too competent. They were more educated than he was. They had better ideas than he had. Now, I don't want to name names, but I mean, I think there were many Pashtuns who have been thrown out who could play a very important role in the next government. And there are moderates in the non-Pashtuns in the north who could also hopefully form some kind of working coalition. But I think a lot of this will depend on how the talks with the Taliban progress and how these are conducted by the Americans and by Karzai. Because there's one perception and one conspiracy theory in Kabul, which is essentially this is a deal that the Karzai family is having with the Taliban. They're going to have a deal with the Taliban to preserve their wealth and the corruption and all the rest of it, and they'll give the Taliban a seat at the table in the government. And this doesn't involve the rest of Afghanistan, the rest of the ethnic groups or anything like that. Now, so far, frankly, I mean, Karzai has not built a consensus in the country for the talks. He has not conducted these talks in a politically wholesome manner. This needs to change. Now, it's not going to change by telling him. I mean, for the American ambassador to go up and say, you've got to change and bring in all these northerners and the non-Pashtuns, he's not going to do that. He's going to change only if there's progress on the ground between the Americans and the Taliban. If he sees the inevitability of a settlement, and a settlement that will have to be fair and square for all Afghans, not just for his family or for his network, as you said, then I think it can happen. I agree with you. I mean, given the present state of affairs of the American deployment in Afghanistan, and given the wishful thinking in the White House, as you described it, that everything is hunky-dory and fine, whereas exactly the opposite is probably true. It does look a long haul. But I wouldn't have been covered Afghanistan for 32 years if I wasn't an optimist. Every time you turn your head around, a new civil war breaks out, and you say, oh my God, and you thought, well, the Soviets left, there's going to be this big deal, a big settlement, peace will come, and et cetera, and within 24 hours, a new civil war break. I mean, I've seen this happen too many times, but I still remain an optimist. I remain an optimist because I really believe that the Afghan people have something in them that really wants, a peace and a settlement. Ordinary Afghan people. I don't mean those who've been cashing in on, corruption and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and look what they've put up with from us for the last 10 years as evidence of your hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have two questions. Firstly, could you share your opinion on whether the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, how distinct are they? Are they two groups with the same ideologies? Are they different? You mentioned earlier on in the evening that you thought that the Afghan Taliban were moving away from their anti-female education stance, whereas the Pakistani Taliban is still blowing up schools in Nowshera and Peshawar and whatnot. So could you share your opinion on whether these two groups are distinct and what makes them so? And the second question is a sort of a follow-up question, is that what would it take for the Pakistani Taliban to achieve some sort of settlement with the Pakistani government which would allow the civilian democracy in Pakistan to survive in a sustainable fashion, not like the Nizami other regulations of 3 years ago?
So just for the sake of those who may not know the nuances, could you also just start by giving a quick thumbnail of who the Pakistani Taliban are today and why they're distinct from the Afghan Taliban?
Well, the Pakistani Taliban initially arose in the Pashtun border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan as a result of the Afghan Taliban's presence and Al-Qaeda's presence in the border regions after 2001. Because all of Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban who survived the American invasion fled into Pakistan. And they set up shop there. They had a lot of money, etc., and they cultivated militancy amongst the Pakistani tribes there. And this militancy then expanded and developed and then started not just helping the war in Afghanistan, but also taking on the Pakistan army. Now, in answer to your question, I think the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban are very distinct entities. The Pakistani Taliban aims at toppling the central government and introducing caliphate. They want to go back to old Islamic times. And the real difference is that they have very close links to Al-Qaeda, and they also have the links of all the militant groups who've operated in Pakistan against India. And these groups, who are basically in Punjab province, many of these fighters form the bulk now of what we call the Pakistani Taliban. So the Pakistani Taliban involves groups from all over the country, which is why they pose a much greater threat than ever before, to Pakistan. And as I said, I think the Afghan Taliban are slowly moderating their positions on various things. Like you mentioned, they don't burn, for the last year or so, as far as I know, the Afghan Taliban have been banned from burning girls' schools, and they allow girls' education. The Pakistani Taliban don't, and they don't allow any kind of education, except their own kind of education. There is... Now, how would the Pakistani Taliban come to rest? Well, look, the Pakistani Taliban's logic is that we are fighting the Pakistan army because there is a jihad in Afghanistan against the infidel Americans. We support that jihad, we fight in that jihad, and the Pakistan army is a stooge of the Americans and is helping the Americans fight that jihad. That is why we are fighting the... Now, if the Afghan Taliban were to make peace with Kabul, and, obviously the whole raison d'etre of jihad would disappear. And then, the Pakistani Taliban, what justification would they have for continuing to attack the Pakistani Taliban? They certainly would not have any kind of religious justification at all. And I think if there was a reasonable kind of peace in Afghanistan, the knock-on effect for that in Pakistan would be enormously productive. The Taliban really would be left without an ideological base. If the right policies were pursued by the military and the next civilian government, then, I think the Pakistani Taliban can be brought to rest. But we have to deal also with these militant groups who've been fighting against India, because they still pose an enormous threat to the stability of Pakistan. They're in large numbers, and they have been supported by the military and the intelligence services for a long period of time. And that status quo has to be broken by the government. Not by attacking them or killing them or anything else, but by trying to bring them into the system. And there are many ways that kind of reconciliation can work.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Rahul. I'm a student at the journalism school. 2 questions to you, Mr. Rashid. The first one is on what happened in Delhi with Salman Rushdie and Imran Khan. And I'd like to know your opinion on what this man is all about, what Imran Khan is all about, what is his politics. 2, do you think by not going to India, he's going to get the mullah vote? Has he struck a deal with the army, etc., etc.? 1. The second question relates to, you threw a slight dig at the Pakistani elite. Now, why is the Pakistani elite, you think, why has it been so apathetic for so long? And what makes the Pakistani elite this strange, inert creature you think it is? Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Well, look,
so you'll have to explain what the India Today dust-up was, because probably not everyone here was following it online.
Imran Khan, of course, is the former cricket star and charitable. He set up hospitals, etc. He's launched himself into politics and has enormous support from young people who want to see change and who are fed up with the existing two major political parties. And that's quite understandable. And the dust-up was that both Imran and Salman Rushdie were invited to Delhi for at a conference, and Imran refused to go because he said that Salman Rushdie, has insulted Muslims with his book, Satanic Verses, etc., and I don't want to go. And Salman Rushdie then responded and said that, he's a stooge of the military and he's a stooge of the mullahs, that's why he didn't come, and etc. So, I mean, but
politics.
Just
politics.
That's politics. Look, I think it's too early to judge Imran Khan. There's no doubt the man is very popular, and he is trying to build a political base. But there are some visible signs that are a bit worrisome. For example, the entire cabinet and the politicians who served with Musharraf, in other words, the last military ruler in Pakistan, have joined Imran Khan. And these politicians, many people in Pakistan know, would not move 1 inch without, clarification from the military if it was okay or not. Secondly, he has had very close links to Islamic parties, the Jamaat-e-Islami and many of the ideologues on the Islamic right. And he's accused liberals of Pakistan of undermining him, etc. But I still believe it's too early. I mean, I think, we have to be faced with an election campaign. We have to see what he's actually offering. At the moment, he's offering everything. I'll get rid of corruption in 90 days. I'll change the economy in 90 days. But obviously, that's going to be a hard sell in an election campaign. He has to become more concrete and more accurate as to what exactly he's going to do and who his friends are, So I think, we have to wait and see.
Yeah, so I was in Pakistan last month and spent some time with him, and all I can add is, in the Saturday Night Live phrase, he looks marvelous. He's still, he's really is. Now, there's 2 people left. There's 5 minutes left. So if the 2 questioners will break the pattern of asking 2 questions each and ask 1 question each, then we can take those, have Ahmed respond to them, and then we'll get you out of here on time. So please.
All right, I'll try to make it quick. I am not an optimist, and my question is, do you think a full-fledged counterinsurgency program aimed at the Taliban is necessary to prevent al-Qaeda from attacking the United States and also necessary to secure the nuclear weapons in Pakistan? Thank you.
And then behind him. Yes, please, you have the last word.
With regards to the nuclear weapons, the Atlantic Monthly ran an article in December essentially alleging that weaponized materials were being transported in utility vans through Islamabad traffic. So I'd be curious to hear your take on that sort of reporting, as far as whether such sensational reporting affects the dynamics of the relationship.
Look, I mean, we know very little about, the state of the nuclear weapons. We certainly know that the army controls them. The army remains a disciplined, hierarchical force. And, at the moment, that discipline and hierarchy is holding. And, I hope it, obviously, everyone hopes it continues to hold. But the other thing is that I think there is a relationship. Certainly there was after 9/11 between Bush and the Pakistani military, and probably with this administration as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. I think, if there was real concern, I think, successive administrations would be going public on it and would be putting far more pressure than we've seen. So I think, as somebody who knows very little about, and Pakistanis generally don't know very much about the state of nuclear weapons. I would say if the Americans are not raising a hoo-ha and NATO is also not raising a kerfuffle on a daily basis, as it is, for example, on us pursuing Haqqani or us pursuing Gulbuddin Hikmatyar or anyone else, there is, tenuous, but I would say a stable control of the nuclear weapons, because the international community does not seem overtly worried about it. But I would not be complacent about it. And as a Pakistani who's been, as I said, I think we need to change our foreign policy. We need to do all sorts of things. And we need to reconcile with these militants inside the country. We need to end this insurgency in Pakistan by the Pakistani Taliban, etc., etc. So it's not an easy issue right away. The second thing is, no, I mean, look, I think Al-Qaeda has more or less been decimated. The core group of Al-Qaeda that existed in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been more or less decimated. I don't think the Afghan Taliban, certainly they've had a very close relationship over the years, but I don't think now, politically speaking, they want a relationship. And they've certainly done their best, I think, to distance themselves from the Taliban. They've categorically said that no foreign group will ever be allowed to take up residence in Afghanistan again, once there's a political settlement inside Afghanistan. I think, that doesn't mean Al-Qaeda is gone, because of course we've got the rebirth of Al-Qaeda in all sorts of new places that didn't exist before, or at least groups who say that they're linked to Al-Qaeda, whether it's Nigeria or Somalia or North Africa or Yemen. And of course you've got the development of Al-Qaeda copycats operating out of Europe. And even for the first time in the United States. I mean, with the Times Square bombing and other individual acts of terrorism, not an organized, but individual acts of terrorism that have taken place. And it seems that most of these acts of terrorism now are getting inspiration, not necessarily from the core group operating in Pakistan or Afghanistan, but operating elsewhere. For example, the Yemeni Al-Qaeda has been much more influential in recent months. So, I don't see that threat. I think, Pakistan needs to sort out its own problems at its own pace with its own solutions. It certainly doesn't need a military adventure by the Americans to come in and tell, to deal with this issue militarily, or because dealing with this issue militarily would lead to disastrous implications. It would certainly divide the country. It could divide the army. It could lead to very catastrophic long-term threats. So Pakistan really needs to sort out its own problems. And the purpose of this book simply is to try and explain, where in the long term Pakistan has gone wrong and where a correction could be made.
Well, and it's a purpose fully realized. Pakistan on the Brink is what's brought us together here. Thanks to Columbia University. Thanks to all of you for participating. And Ahmed, as always, it's just an inspiration to listen to you and a privilege. I think what those of us who know you in Lahore perhaps take for granted that people here should understand is that your work is not only brilliant and persistent and careful and clear in all the ways that your talk today has been, but it really is also an act of personal courage. You're under direct threat periodically in the setting where you work. You have stayed year after year. You have gone back to Afghanistan year after year. And you really have our admiration for the whole of it, and also for your ability to use the words hoo-ha and kerfluffle in the same sentence. So I challenge any speaker at Columbia University to match that. All right, thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.